class, the Asia-Pacific War. And those of you on Zoom, if you're wondering why I keep looking to the side here, is there's been a problem with this facility. And apparently what happened is a squirrel got into the roof and ate the wires for the camera that's directly across from me. So that we'll be trying to work to both sides here because of the situation. By Thursday, they're going to have a new camera, so next week this should not be a problem. But for right now, I'm going to be doing this a lot. So again, welcome. What this class is about is, make it simple really, is that if we look at World War I, the largest change out of World War I is the change in the map of Europe. We see the Imperial German collapse. We see the Tsar gone. We see the Austro-Hungarian Empire gone. And we see, of course, the Ottoman Empire gone. So all four of those empires no longer exist after World War I. And this causes a tremendous amount of change in the map of Europe. There's new countries that haven't existed in that recent history, particularly countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Iraq, and Syria. All these new countries come about after World War I. When World War II, I think we're going to see a similar situation, only it's not going to be in Europe, it's going to be in Asia. We're going to see countries that were under subjugation, if you want to put it, of imperialist powers, Britain, certainly Japan. And we're going to see these countries become now world powerhouses. Countries like Indonesia did not exist. Of course, India becomes an independent country, and many, many others, Burma, and China is able to now become totally independent once again. So there's that, I think, is really the biggest change that we get out of World War II as far as the results of that are occurring in our world today. And hopefully what I'll do with this class is I'll be able to take us through this first semester, then get into in the second semester, I'll do probably 4 or 5 more classes because I can't finish this topic in 8 classes. It's impossible to give it its due. And when we get through that, I think hopefully we'll get a little bit into how the end of World War II and the end of the colonial period in Asia is affecting us today in the world. So well, that's my hope, but I've still got to build all those classes, so we'll see how that goes. But that's kind of what we're trying to do today, and hopefully you'll all enjoy this class and it'll be informative, some stuff that perhaps you haven't heard much about before, because I think that parts of this battles and things that went on in the Asian continent particularly are not well known here in the US. So when we look at our view of the war in the Pacific, that's what we would say here, is we think of things like this, like the Marines on Peleliu, a beach with palm trees and, the Marines charging up. And that's kind of one of the major things we see when we talk about this. And this particular battle includes the very famous Eugene Sledge, who has a very big ties to Auburn, wrote the famous book With the Old Breed. So again, it's one of the things we think about when we see this part of World War II. Another thing, of course, is going to be the attack of Pearl Harbor. That's an iconic picture with the destruction of the Arizona. And this changed Americans' opinion of what was going on in the world at that time instantaneously. Remember, there was a large isolationist movement in previous to our entry into World War II. And of course, this attack on Pearl Harbor galvanized the American public, and the isolationist movement basically disappeared in a couple of days. But perhaps the most iconic picture of all is this one, the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. This is a huge piece of American history right here, this famous picture, so much so that the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Forrestal, said upon seeing this picture and what was going on at Iwo, said that there will be a Marine Corps for the next 500 years because of this. And Americans feel a tremendous amount of patriotism when we see these images. We feel good about how World War II worked out for us and for the world too as well. But we feel good about this. And another thing is, like, you look at the British look at the Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, and they look at that with great pride, you know, that they defeated Nazi Germany, and they feel good about that. The Russians, even today, you see this with Putin's propaganda, talking about how the great patriotic war saved the world from Nazism. And he uses that specifically against the Ukrainians right now. So we can see that countries view this war in a way to feel good about themselves and to help basically their growth of nationalism. Well, today, China is doing a similar thing. The Chinese have basically not had a lot to do with World War II as far as they feel the history, because primarily what happened is the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were basically excluded from Chinese history. And that is finally coming around, I would say since about probably 1985, where now it's important for the Chinese to realize that there was this duality to their work in World War II. And their work in World War II was surprisingly important, which we're hopefully going to talk about today. So that's what we're going to start with. And let us go to this picture. When we think about it, this is the largest battlefield in the world. It stretches from Australia, where the city of Darwin was bombed many, many times by the Japanese, all the way up to the Aleutian Islands, off the coast of Alaska, all the way to the United States coast, where Japanese submarines shelled our coastline. They actually launched aircraft to bomb our forests, to create forest fires. We see that as a problem today with forest fires. So they had the right idea, it just didn't work out because of weather conditions, but indeed they tried to do that. So we go all the way to the US West Coast and then all the way to India, where in 1944, the Japanese actually invaded India. So it is a giant battlefield, and it contains all these other countries. You can see it: China, Britain, Australia, India, Holland, Burma, Philippines, New Zealand. Russia has a big place in this, and particularly in the history of what's going to happen here. And of course, many other countries. So let's go back in time. And we're going to talk about the Chinese, and particularly early and mid portion of the Qing dynasty. And China in the 18th and 19th century is a huge country. It has a tremendous amount of population. It has a tremendous land area. It can arguably be said that it is the most powerful and largest country in the world at that time. And you could see some of the structures that they were able to build under the Qings. Well, those of you that have taken Dr. Bohannon's class on European consumerism are well aware about the 18th century and the importation of Chinese goods to Europe and the United States as well. We've got a lot of things. In fact, when you maybe at Christmas dinner, you all pull out your good china. And indeed, the reason for that is a lot of porcelain and a lot of consumer goods came from China. And what that's going to cause is a very big surplus of economically, because the Chinese emperor said, hey, you know, we are so powerful and we are such a big country that we don't really need anything from the other parts of the world. We have everything we need right here. So when you trade with us, we don't want your stuff. We want bullion. We want silver. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a tremendous amount of trade imbalance between China and Europe and the United States particularly. And it really gets out of control when tea becomes the national drink of England. And the English are very, very concerned about this, because there's all this wealth going out of Europe going directly to China, and they need to come up with an answer how they're going to avoid that. And the answer is going to be opium. And there's going to be a tremendous amount of drug abuse in China that is supported by foreign governments. So much so that it's believed by 1840, 1/5 of all the silver in China was being spent on opium. Well, I think I need to discuss how this is going to happen a little bit. So the Chinese have a thing called the Canton system. And the Canton system basically limits the foreigners to deliver goods only to 2 ports. One is Macau and one is Canton. So if I'm a trader from Europe, let's say from England, the East India Company particularly, what I'm supposed to do is I'm supposed to sail into the Bay of Canton, and I'm supposed to have the Hong, which are the merchants, under a leadership called the Kohong, and they are to come out into my ship while I'm still in the bay and inspect it cargo to make sure there's nothing illicit on that cargo. Well, then I'm allowed to go into the port and I'm allowed to unload my cargo into what they refer to as factories, which I would consider actually is more like a warehouse. Well, those factories, warehouses, are only controlled by Westerners. Chinese are not allowed to work in these facilities. So basically the idea is to isolate these people completely from Chinese society. You see a similar thing in Japan, where they have they actually make an island where the Dutch can land on this island, only the Dutch, and they can't ever leave that little tiny island. They unload their cargo, and from there they are to go away. You see a similar thing actually in Amsterdam at times. Amsterdam had similar laws. So what happens here is the East India Company is growing opium, particularly in India, and they are shipping it to China. And remember, the Chinese have a large merchant fleet as well. But that merchant fleet only really goes like to places like the Philippines and Indonesia, etc. They don't go to Europe with that fleet. So the excuse me, the Chinese traders, my smugglers would probably be a better term, will meet these ships outside the port. They will unload the opium, and then they will smuggle the opium into the factories in Canton particularly. So you can see there's a lot of bribes going on. There's a lot of criminality involved with this whole thing, and it's all being supported by the opium trade. So that's kind of what's going on with this. Well, the Chinese government says, hey, to the English particularly, because they're really the biggest offenders of this, please, you've got to stop doing this, okay? You're ruining our economy, and you're ruining the health of our people. And I just need to mention briefly, too, that the British were indeed the biggest offenders in this, but indeed there were significant amounts of Americans that were involved in this trade as well. Part of that, some of the people you may be familiar with was a man named Warren Delano. Warren Delano is actually FDR's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather. The Forbes family was heavily involved in this trade, made their fortune there. And if you've ever been to Boston and perhaps gone to see the Bunker Hill Monument, the Bunker Hill Monument was funded by a man named, I believe, Thomas Perkins. And Thomas Perkins was probably the first American involved in this trade. And the Bunker Hill Monument was actually built with money that came from this illegal opium trade in China. Oh, and the Massachusetts General Hospital too. So there's been a lot of stuff going on with this. Now, what the next thing the Chinese do is the Emperor of China sends Queen Victoria a letter, a personal letter, saying, please stop this trade. And they ignore it completely. British say, yeah, well, you don't care, you know. So the Chinese are fed up. and they move on a factory inside Canton, and they seize 1,433 tons of opium from one factory. The British are not happy about that, and they're demanding reparations and we want our money back for our basically illegal drugs. And so they begin to attack the port of Macau. It starts basically what's known as the First Opium War, and it's outrageous behavior if you think about this. Now, the British have superior technology, and they are going to force what's known as the first of the unequal treaties. This becomes what in China is known as the 100 Years of Humiliation, where time after time after time, these treaties are forced upon them. But I want to take, everybody that's had my classes knows I love technology, military technology. So I want to point out this picture. And you can see on this picture, I've circled a ship. That ship is known as the Nemesis. It's one of a class of 6 ships built by the East India Company. And this is an amazing vessel. If you think about it, it is the first ocean-going, iron-hulled, compartmentalized steamship warship ever built. It's armed with 2 32-pound swivel mount cannons and 4 6-pounder cannons. Now think about this. This isn't built by the British Navy. This is built by a company. Builds a fleet of warships to support the opium trade in China. Oh, by the way, it has a really shallow draft, so it can go upriver, and the Chinese can't escape. So, amazingly, think this through. Now, if we brought this into today's world, imagine that you're buying illegal drugs from Amazon, and Amazon is sending a Bradley armored personnel carrier to your door to deliver your drugs, and the police cannot stop them because they're in an armored personnel carrier. And it's a very similar thing to what is going on here. It's just amazing that these companies would go to these levels to continue to make profits. And so that brings us to the first of the unequal treaties, the Treaty of Nanking. Basically, the British demand payment for the war, all their expenses. The Chinese are forced to do this. They are forced to give up the Canton system and open 5 more ports. And also another interesting thing is they are going to be ceded the island of Hong Kong. They do not return the island of Hong Kong until 1997. So we can see that this is going on for a long, long time, and it started a long time ago. Then it's followed by the Treaty of Bogu. The Bogu, by the way, is a warship, and that's where the treaty is signed. And that gives the British 2 other key things. It gives them extraterritoriality, and it also gives them most favored nation status. So let's look at extraterritoriality first. Extraterritoriality means that if I'm a citizen of Britain or other countries eventually, and I'm in China, I am not subject to Chinese law. I am only subject to theoretically British law, but of course Britain is thousands of miles away. So basically, I can do pretty much anything I want in China at this point. The Chinese have no capability to charge me against crime. So of course, this is going to lead to significant amounts of abuses to the Chinese people. That law is not taken out until 1943, where extraterritoriality is going on in China. So again, this has got a long, long history. Well, so we've seen that China is getting these unequal treaties, and there's a lot of issues with drug abuse. This continues to go on into the 1850s and 1860s significantly. And there's a second Opium War. But this is going to lead to a thing called the Taiping Rebellion. I think personally, Taiping Rebellion is the wrong way to review this. I think this isn't a rebellion. This is a civil war. Key thing here is the Qing dynasty is Manchu, is Manchurian, is Northern Chinese. What they're going to be taxing and basically abusing the Han people and the Hakka as well. So there's a major issue between these two groups. Basically, again, it's like a civil war. So it's going to be a gigantic conflict. It's actually the largest conflict of the 19th century when we think about that. We've had, the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. You've had the American Civil War. You've had the wars between Austria, France, and Germany in the 1860s and 70s. This conflict is much, much larger. It's huge, actually. And it starts with this man, Hong Xiuquan. And Hong becomes ill, and he's very, very sick. And he has feverish dreams. And he recovers, and people think, he starts telling people about his dreams, and they think, he's been sick and he's a little crazy. And then he becomes associated with Christian missionaries. And he begins to interpret his dreams as he is the brother of Jesus Christ. He begins to grow disciples. The disciples begin to spread his version of Christianity throughout China, particularly the Han and the Hakka. And he is going to create a thing called the Heavenly Kingdom. And it's primarily located in Nanking or Nanjing. And it's going to be a very socialist, and because remember, these people are heavily taxed. There's a lot of famine going on. There's a lot of issues in China, particularly the Qing have been weakened by the two Opium Wars. And this movement gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and they begin to win a lot of victories. Well, the Qing are in a major issue with this breakdown of centralized government at this point. So they are fighting heavily. And eventually what happens is this gentleman, they believe he was either just died or was poisoned. And eventually the Heavenly Kingdom is defeated by the Qing dynasty. But how do they defeat them? They defeat them with the use of private armies. And this will eventually grow into what is known in the early 20th century as the era of the warlords. So again, you see the Qing government just breaking down because they can't keep the Europeans out. They can't keep the Han under control. They have more and more problems with maintaining a centralized government. And now they've unleashed the warlords within their own midst. So they're in a major, major issue. Well, what's going on in Japan? Yes.
The British military was allied with the Qing government and played an important role in stomping out the Heavenly Kingdom.
Yes, that was in the aftermath of the Second Opium War.
Yeah. So it was a curious imperialistic, but an alliance, at least briefly, an alliance of convenience.
They didn't want a centralized socialist government,
Right.
definitely. And by the way, today, the Taiping Rebellion is looked at as by the communists as because it had so much socialist aspects to it, free land, etc., that they look at this as something that was good. Okay, they look at the Heavenly Kingdom, even though it was theoretically sort of Christian, they look at this as something that was a good event. So the communists basically see this as positive. Well, again, back to Japan. What's going on? Well, there's a thing called the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa shogunate is in control of Japan. At this point in Japanese history, the emperor is just really a religious figure. He is not a major figure of government at all. And so the Tokugawa shogunate is, the best way to look at it is it's feudalism. The Tokugawa shogunate is going to isolate Japan for about 200 plus years. And so what happens is you cannot go to Japan except for little trading ports, like I described, with the little island for the Dutch. The Japanese people cannot leave Japan except certain political groups that are, liaisons to foreign nations, but the average Japanese cannot leave. If you're a foreign merchant and you land on Japan, maybe you are shipwrecked, you are imprisoned. So they want no outside influence whatsoever. So basically they isolate themselves for 200 years. They also disarm the majority of their population. Even swords are confiscated from people that are not approved to have these. So they're hundreds of years behind technology that's going on in Europe at this time. Again, we're talking about the 1850s here. So they're way, way, way behind. And the United States is looking to open up trade with Japan. And the big reason, I think, is because coal ships are now starting to become the way to go. People see that coal is necessary, but coal-powered ships have a very, very short range, and they need coaling stations. And perhaps you've heard in high school that Perry went there to open up trade, and it was really great for Japan. The Japanese at the time didn't think so much about that. They were a little less than happy to see Perry and his black ship show up. And so Perry goes there and says, hey, we want to trade with you guys and everything's going to be great. And the Japanese are like, well, we really don't want to trade with you. We don't really want you here at all. And Perry goes, well, gee, I guess we'll just have to destroy you. So he sails into Tokyo Bay. He's been there for off and on in Okinawa, etc., for almost 2 years. And he sails into Tokyo Bay, and he fires a 73-gun blank salute at the Japanese capital and says that this is how we celebrate Independence Day. The Japanese, of course, are intimidated by these vessels. Again, they're 200 years behind in technology, and they have no choice but to fold. They're under duress, and they basically give up. Well, what happens, of course, afterwards, is then Britain, Russia, France, and others also demand the same concessions in order to trade. Alan, you have a question?
The trade was that Perry was seeking with Japan.
Oh, general stuff, military goods, anything really.
They want Japan to be a market.
Yes, of course. Yes, they wanted Japanese to be a market, and they wanted it to be a coaling station.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe it was certain commodities they were looking for from Japan.
That will actually be more of an issue with China.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. But anyway, so that's kind of what's going on with Japan at that time. But when Perry is there, the Tokugawa shogunate falls. And what they start is what's known as the Meiji Restoration. And the Meiji Restoration is a total change in government. Look at it a little bit like this. Look at it kind of like the way that the Kaiser was in his relationship to the government. The Japanese constitution is similar to that, with one huge exception. The emperor is considered a living god. So not only is he head of state, but he's head of the religion as well. So that's a huge significant difference in how the government is functioning. Remember, the Meiji, when this occurs, is only a 16-year-old boy. So he's not really, he's the emperor, yes, but he grows into the position, let's say it that way. So the Japanese know what's going on in China. They see that China is being subjugated by Western powers, and the last thing in the world they want is that to happen to them. And so what are they going to do? Well, they start a massive ability to westernize themselves. They realize that they need the technology of the West and need to embrace it with both hands in order to become a modern nation state that's able to defend itself. And so they reach out originally to the French for their army. After 1871, they decide to change gears and go reach out to the Germans. And probably most famously, they reach out to the British to build a navy, because remember, they're an island nation. So much so did they copy the British that their version of Annapolis, which is known as Etajima, they actually build it out of the same type of red bricks that the British Admiralty is built out of. I mean, they are way into it. They copy this exactly. So, and of course, they begin to buy British ships. They buy ships from France. They buy weapons from Germany. They buy weapons from French. They modernize, and they, in just really less than 50 years, they've become actually a modern economy. From going from feudalism to that in such a short time is pretty amazing on their part. And that's going to lead to a few changes in what's going on in Asia. But let's talk about, I should have brought this up first, but I just love this picture. This is a Japanese picture circa the 1850s of Perry's black ships. Notice it has a paddle wheel steamer. There's smoke coming out of the smokestack. Again, they don't have steamships. And the cannon are firing, they look like laser beams coming out of this thing. So the Japanese are heavily intimidated by Western technology and Perry's ships. Well, that brings us to the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. And this is going to be the first modern version of the term Hako Ichiyu. What is Hako Ichiyu? Hako Ichiyu means simply that the 8 corners of the world are under the rule of the benevolent emperor. Now, when we think of the world, we think of it in 2-dimensional ways as the 4 corners of the world. The Japanese think of it in a 3-dimensional way as the 8 corners of the world. This term is actually attributed to the very first Japanese emperor. I would be very surprised if in case that was the deal, but they attribute it to Jimmu, who is the first emperor of Japan. He is considered to be a direct descendant from the gods, the kami. So he is indeed a living god. And his ancestors all become the same thing. They are all considered at this point to be living gods. So head of state, head of religion. Furthermore, they believe that they are the Yamato people. The Yamato people, they are the progenitors of the human race. So they have not only the rule of a god, but they are also entitled, they believe that they are the progenitors of the human race and are destined to again in the future become the leaders of the world. Now, this is not to be confused with Hitler and Lebensraum. This is a Confucian idea. So they don't see themselves as the Aryan race. They see themselves as the father of Asian, particularly at this time, nations. So it's significantly different than Hitler. Okay, it really is a whole kind of different ballgame, but it still has similar ideas that indeed they believe that they should have control, benevolent control of the world and particularly Asia at this time. So how is this going to lead to this war? Well, simply, the Qing have been nothing but a failure. They're a disaster, really. They can't centralize their military is in poor shape, even though they've been buying weapons from the West. And the Japanese go, you know, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to go help free the Koreans from Chinese rule because, well, you know, as a great nation, we need to have natural resources, and we don't have a lot of natural resources in Japan. So we need to help people in Asia by helping them by us taking their goods. So they go into Korea, and Korea is a monarchy at this time, but it's subjugated by the Chinese. The Chinese send military forces in there, and the West believes seriously that the Japanese don't have a prayer because they've been selling a lot of weapons to the Chinese too. The Japanese beat them and beat them bad. And so you see at the end of this war that the first regional dominance is changed from China to now Japan is the leading player in Asia. So it's a significant change there. And if you want to read up on the Japanese behavior in Formosa at this time, it's incredibly brutal for being so nice about things. They really were rather harsh about the way they handled their fatherly duties. So this leads us to another unequal treaty, an unequal treaty that is created by an Asian nation, not a Western nation. And it's the Treaty of Shimonoseki. And basically they said, well, you have to give Korea its independence. First thing, Korea gets independent. It doesn't last very long. Articles 2 and 3, they'll cede to Japan in perpetuity, full sovereignty of the pescadores, Formosa, which we know today as Taiwan, and the eastern portion of the Bay of the Liaodong Peninsula. Big pieces of Asia now are going to be under Japanese control. Well, as to the Koreans, by 1910, the Japanese have basically dissolved the Korean monarchy, and they have taken control and turned Korea into a puppet state. And they control access to the sea, as you can see. Next slide will be easier to see it. Of the Chinese capital in Taiping or Beijing, as we know it today. Of course, they now have got a foothold in Manchuria, and now they can get the natural resources from this area. Well, doesn't quite work out that way, because there's the triple intervention. The French, the Russians, and the Germans all intervene and make the Japanese give up large portions of what they've gained in this war. So you can see in the map, that is where the Liaodong Peninsula is. They have also taken over coastal areas across from Taiwan/Formosa. And the Japanese appeal to the United States and to Britain and say, can you help us out here? We won this war, and all of a sudden they're taking away our stuff. And Britain and the United States wash their hands of this. They don't want anything to do with it. So it's interesting that Japan is forced to back down at this point. Well, Russia, we're going to help the Chinese out here. Well, we probably want to lease the Liaodong Peninsula. And by the way, we're going to fortify Port Arthur. Okay. And then Germany takes concessions, more unequal treaties. France, Britain, all take more concessions from China that they were there to help with the triple intervention. Well, a lot of historians think that what really occurred here is the fact that the Japanese see this as, well, if the Western powers can go and do this to China, we certainly, as the Yamato people, we can do this as well. And they see this completely as another just a reason why they should become an imperialist power. It's interesting that they were forced to back down, and then at the same point, they're going to basically emulate the West and actually going to accelerate that issue. So a key part of this is the fact that the West did involve and did again take more concessions from China. It just shows how weak the Qing really are. And here's a picture from a French publication. I find it's very fun too. You see the Chinese gentleman, yelling, "Stop!" You see Queen Victoria, the Kaiser, the Tsar. The lady is France, and the Japanese kind of looking over the pie. So, and they're carving up China regardless. And so this is what's going on in the world. This is how the Chinese are getting treated. Well, major piece here is Japan is going to start a war with Russia. And this is going to be the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. And the way this starts is the Japanese reach out to the Russians and say, hey, we want to make a deal. You give us all of North Korea, and we'll let you kind of do whatever you want in Manchuria. And the Russians say, North Korea is awful close to Vladivostok, and we don't really think this is such a great idea. So why don't you just do this? We'll keep Manchuria, and we will demilitarize North Korea. Well, Japanese don't really think much of this. They think this is, I don't think that's a good deal. But what do? They attack Port Arthur. They isolate the Russian fleet that's in Port Arthur and begin to destroy its warships. And they do this 3 hours before they declare war. So now what does that remind you of? So this seems to be a tactic, okay? But anyway, the Japanese once again are surprisingly successful, okay? They blockade Port Arthur. They eventually capture land. They invade the Liaodong Peninsula and capture it from land. They defeat most of the Russian forces in that area. The Russians send a large fleet all the way from Russia around the world. And in 1905, that's a major effort. And that is destroyed at the very famous Battle of Tsushima Strait. That is the strait that's between Korea and Japan that leads towards Vladivostok. And so everything is going hunky-dory for the Japanese in this thing. Well, there's one big problem. They're going broke. They can't afford to do this war. And consequently, their economy is about to collapse. So they reach out to Theodore Roosevelt and say, hey, things are going pretty well for us. We've won all the battles and everything's good. And, we'd kind of like to make peace right now. We think this is a good time to make peace. And they reach out to Teddy and say, hey, let's, can you help us out here? Well, the Japanese demand Russia to evacuate Manchuria completely. They want the complete control of Sakhalin Island. And they want, of course, reparations. Because guess what? They're broke. They need cash because they're going to go bankrupt. Well, remember, Russia's a big country and it's got a lot more population than Japan. And the Russians begin to stall because what they're going to do is they're going to move 4 brand new fresh divisions down from the main part of Russia in order to try to capture the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur again. Unfortunately, there's a problem for the Tsar. He's in the midst of a revolution. And this revolution takes place in 1905-06 at the same time that's basically the peasant population of Russia is extremely unhappy the way they're being treated. Some of the elites and the intelligentsia are against what's going on as well. And they force the Tsar to create a thing called the Duma. So he becomes now more of a constitutional monarch. So he's got a lot of problems going on as well. So he's basically going to say, okay, fine. I got too many problems in the main part of Russia to be worrying about Manchuria at this point. So Roosevelt gets the Japanese to agree to half of Sakhalin Island, return Port Arthur to China. Remember, they don't get it, but Chinese get Port Arthur back, and to demilitarize Manchuria. And of course, most importantly, no indemnities at all, no cash to Japan. Japan, they got no choice but to accept this. They have nothing they can do about it. They can't have these Russian troops. They know they can't fight Russia in a really long war. So the Japanese people are incensed by this. They can't understand this. How could this be? We've won all the battles. We've destroyed their navy. And now we're going to be cheated by the United States. The United States is going to cheat us out of what we deserve as the Yamato people. And they blame us for this. And anti-U.S. riots break out all over Japan. So much so that the Japanese government has to declare martial law in Japan because the Japanese people are going crazy. Well, in Asia, they see this one way. They see this as a Japanese victory. Now, remember, Japan, after defeating China, is already considered to be the leading power in Asia by Asian people. But now they see that the Japanese have actually beaten a Western power. This is incredible. Yeah, go Asia. All right. It's like, they're really, really impressed with this. And Japan is looked as something to be emulated on this level, not in others. And it basically helps breed a thing called Pan-Asianism, which we will talk about more in the future. But it's key to note that this is a huge event for the Asian people. The West doesn't see it as that. The West sees it like, well, the Japanese beat the Russians. I mean, come on, anybody could beat the Russians. They're terrible. So they don't see it at all as an important issue. Of course, by 1930s and 40s, they will see it as a very important issue. But at this point, not so much. Well, we go back to China and the end of the Qing dynasty. And simply this is that there's the Boxer Rebellion, and I'm not going to go make this long, but the Boxer Rebellion takes place by a group called the Chinese Fighting Club. I believe that's how they're really termed. And they begin to kill Western missionaries. There's legations in key cities that have troops for foreign powers, and they begin to isolate those and attack those legations. And it creates a major, major issue for Western powers. You can see in this list, virtually everybody and their brother sends troops to China to free particularly the forces in Beijing. And starts with another unequal treaty called the Boxer Protocol. And the Boxer Protocol is going to allow foreign troops to be actually garrisoned in Chinese cities to protect the legations. We see this in the United States with the use of U.S. Marines permanently stationed in China at this time. We also send gunboats, the famous Panay incident, which we'll talk about in a future class, because we now have gunboats patrolling Chinese rivers. So the Qing are so powerless and so disorganized that they can't control their own country, is in our opinion. And indeed, we have to basically send troops. And of course, the Japanese send most. Well, so the Qing realize they're in trouble. So they know, whoa, this isn't going well. So what are they going to do? They're going to try to have some reforms, particularly for the Han. And for the Han to, get some deals so that there's not going to be a revolution, because they know it's coming. And Manchu elites say, we're not giving up our prerogatives to these people. We can deal with them. Well, unfortunately, that turns out to be a bad idea, and it isolates the Qing even more. It aggravates the elites, and there's more and more issues with what's going on in China. Well, then there's the Wuchang Uprising, and that leads, of course, to the Shanghai Revolution. This revolution is actually done by a warlord. It's not done by Sun Yat-sen and the Nationalists. And let me state something clearly from now on for this class. I'm not going to refer to the Kuomintang or the KMT. I'm going to refer to that piece of the Chinese government as the Nationalists. So in the future, please understand that's what I'm talking about, those of you that are aware of that issue. So the nationalist government doesn't really exist at this point. In fact, Sun Yat-sen, I believe, is in the United States trying to raise money when this revolution takes place. Well, the revolution takes place, and the Chinese emperor, who's a child, Puyi, he abdicates. And basically at this point, the Chinese government, what little there is of it, is between the nationalists, because Sun Yat-sen comes back quickly as can to try to organize things, and this particular warlord. So basically look at the government as being fragmented. And the warlord actually is attacked by Sun Yat-sen and the nationalists and defeats them, and Sun actually has to go back to Japan and hide out. So that happens until 1916, and then in 1916 the warlord dies. Sun comes back and he becomes the provisional president of the Republic of China under the nationalists. Well, Sun is really a socialist. He believes in socialization of the Chinese people. He today is still considered to be a great leader by the Chinese Communist Party. You can see his mausoleum here that was built by his successor. We'll talk about that in a second. But he reaches out to the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union is newly created and it's kind of a pariah government. And he reaches out to them and says, hey, you know, we could use some aid and we need to create a country. And, you know, the Soviets are like thinking, well, you know, there's some advantages to this for us. So, but China's just not ready to be a communist country. So first thing we need to do is we need to help the Chinese industrialize, create a bourgeoisie. And once they create a bourgeoisie, we will be able to then turn it into a communist country. That's their thinking. Well, the Soviets thought that a stronger China also would be a very good deterrent to Japan. Because Japan, because of its sort of like a theocracy, is incredibly anti-communist. Believe me, the communists do not like religion. And of course, the Japanese are ruled by a living God. Also, at the end of World War I, the Soviet government and Russia itself are basically, I guess, invaded is sort of overstating it, but the U.S. sends troops, the British sends troops, the Japanese send a lot of troops to take back weapons that had been given to the Tsarist government. That is the reasoning. And the Japanese and the U.S. send major forces into Vladivostok, and the Japanese begin to expand into Siberia. I mean, if you look at a map, they take a huge part of Siberia that now is under Japanese control. And they are forced by the League of Nations and the Nine-Power Agreement and Washington Naval, which I'm not going to talk about because it'll take too long. They're forced to basically withdraw from the Soviet Union by 1922. But the Soviets are well aware of what they've done. And so that's why they're more than willing to try to help China as a deterrent, again, against the Japanese. Well, Sun dies, and there's two major factions. There's kind of, and this will be more important later, but there's sort of a peace faction ruled by a gentleman who is the logical successor to, everybody thinks he would be the successor to Sun Yat-sen. But the military leader of the Nationalists is Chiang Kai-shek, and he actually will become, because he's willing to work with more people, he actually will become the leader of the nationalist government. And he gains strong support, even though he's incredibly anti-communist, from the Russians, from the Soviets, because again, they want to stop, they want to help Japan or help China be a deterrent to Japan. So they're starting to rebuild their economy. You can see this mausoleum was built by Chiang, and he's trying to rebuild the city of Nanking to become their new capital. And today you can still see this mausoleum. Because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't think that Sun was a bad guy. They think he was a precursor to their socialist world. But who's mad about this? The Japanese. The Japanese are incredibly unhappy because they're afraid that China is going to actually have a real nationalist government, which is going to deter their ability to become an imperialist power on the Asian mainland. And so that's going to lead to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. The Japanese Kwantung Army, this is the army that's stationed in Korea, decides on their own that they're going to create a provocation and capture Manchuria. But no government approval. So the government of Japan is totally unaware that this is going on. And what that's going to be is the first function of something called Gekkokujo. And Gekkokujo means rule from below. It's a very odd thought process to me. I can't imagine that if I totally broke the rules, that I wouldn't be punished by my superiors. This is not how this works. Gekkokujo basically simply is this. If I firmly believe that I know what's right for Japan and the Yamato people, that even though I'm not in key power, I have the right to do what I think is right, regardless of my orders. It's a strange concept. So, two lieutenants, colonels, they're Itagaki and Ishiwara. They create a false flag incident. They set off. There's a railroad in Manchuria that is owned by the Japanese, and they set some explosives near these railroad tracks. They detonate the explosives, and they use this as a false flag incident. Now, how lame is this? The explosives are so weak that the railroad tracks are fully functional 6 hours later, and Japanese troops are going down that rail line. That's how weak this explosive was and how lame it was. I mean, it's totally a fabrication. Well, so now the Japanese army is going into Manchuria, and that the general in charge of the Kwantung army, the Japanese government's going, hey, wait, whoa, don't be doing, what are you guys, crazy? Hanjo goes, yeah, we're doing great. It just keeps going further and further into Manchuria. And the Japanese government goes, well, this is kind of working out. Maybe this Gekkokujo isn't such a bad idea after all. And they send in 3 more divisions to take Manchuria. Well, the Japanese, really, even with 3 more divisions, are heavily outnumbered by the Chinese army. But it's a warlord army. They're poorly trained. They're poorly armed, and the Japanese are just roll over them. There's no big issue there. They put up basically token resistance. And this is going to lead to a thing called the Tangyu Truce. And the world is outraged that the Japanese have done this. Remember, we've got a lot of peace, the Calabrian and all these other peace things under the League of Nations, and the Japanese go ahead and do this thing willy-nilly. Well, of course, the Japanese are doing this primarily because of the Depression. They know they need to get more money, more resources to help pull themselves out of the Depression. And the League sends in a thing called the Lytton Commission, and the Lytton Commission, they give the Japanese a little slap on the hand, and it's not a big deal, it's China after all. And the Japanese are angry about this. They're so angry, in fact, that they basically ignore the Lytton Commission and withdraw from the League of Nations. We're so, we don't need you guys. And really, the League of Nations is powerless to do anything at this point against the Japanese. Well, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists are well aware that this is a problem, and they're too weak to confront the Japanese. So what did the Japanese do, of course, is they want this thing called the Tangyu Truce. And you can see on this map, the lined area is going to be a demilitarized zone between Manchuria and the Chinese government. This is an interesting demilitarized zone because the Japanese army can control it. The Japanese army can overfly it. The Chinese are basically told to keep out. Yes.
Roughly, what is the scale of that map? What would be the size of that territory that's lined off there?
Really big. And Manchuria is even bigger. Okay, so it's just another unequal treaty, really. So now the Japanese are fully involved in becoming an imperialist power in China. I didn't even go into the 21 demands during World War I. I just didn't have time. But you can look that up on Wikipedia. Look up the 21 demands, World War I, and you'll see how this is evolving as time goes on. But anyway, so the Japanese decide to set up a puppet government called Manchukuo, and that is going to be under the theoretic rule of the former emperor Puyi. So Puyi, once again, is emperor of part of China. only he's really a puppet of the Japanese. So that's kind of where the Tangu Truce is going. Well, the Japanese people, they're thrilled. The Japanese population is like, this is great. We're going to get out of the depression because we got all this new property, all this new land. We got a place to help move people. We have a place for get ourselves out of the troubles of the depression. And that's exactly how they're going to do that. Well, Chiang and the Nationalists, they're faced with the loss of Manchuria, and this is a disaster, but you can see something else that comes out of this quite simply is that now the Japanese are viewed as a pariah nation. So it's a huge propaganda victory for the nationalists, and you can see that they are now being recognized worldwide as the legitimate government of China, as opposed to the warlords. So now for once, the Japanese have really basically created something they never wanted to create, was a legitimate nationalized government in China. Well, I got to talk real briefly about Chiang's wife, Sun Mi-ling. Most people know her as the famous Madame Chiang. She had an incredibly long life. She lived well over 100 years, was actually born in the 19th century and died in the 21st century. So think about the amount of people she met and seen. Well, she's very, very wealthy family, and she's completely educated in the United States, along with two of her brothers. And she's in the United States now trying to raise funds so that the Chinese can begin to rearm, because Chiang knows he needs to rearm quickly. And Chiang is really fighting two different groups. There's a group in China that wants to confront the Japanese immediately because they're very, very afraid of further Japanese incursions. And they're also a major group. Remember that guy I briefly mentioned, said that was supposed to be Sun Yat-sen's successor? He leads a peace group that wants to basically give in to the Japanese at this point because he feels they're too weak to confront the Japanese. So he's really torn with this. And the nationalists really begin at this point, after this disaster in Manchuria, to rebuild their country, particularly around, like I said, Nanking. They start to build a lot of paved roads. They start to make rail lines that never existed, and they're taking rail lines and moving them into the interior. This will be a key later on when the Japanese and the Chinese go fully to war, and it basically gives the Chinese someplace to retreat to. So they're planning a long-term war here. Well, who do they reach out to? The Germans. Hey, started in 26 under the Weimar Republic. So the Weimar Republic was, again, a pariah country, and they're looking for, support. And so we can work with China. We like them. The Soviets are working with China. All the pariahs of the world basically are working with China. And then when the Nazis take over, they really start working with China. I mean, they're like, this is a big time funding and giving them armaments. And why is that? Because Hitler is preparing for a long war himself. And he knows the British will eventually blockade Germany if he goes to war with England. And he needs to get as much stockpiled of key materials as he possibly can, particularly items like tungsten, because Germany doesn't have access to these things. And once they're blockaded, they're not going to have access. And so they start putting in military advisors, and they start with industrialization, and they're really spending some serious money. So much so that they send this Alexander von Falkenhausen, and he becomes Chiang's chief military advisor at this point. And what he says is, the Chinese army is all wrong with these warlords and these giant, untrained, poorly armed mass armies. This isn't what you need. You need to build a small, potent army of 60 divisions trained by the Germans, German armed, and loyal completely to the nationalist government, not to warlords. And again, they continue to send more and more and more money and arms to China. And so I love this picture. You can see the German style helmets, and they're shaking hands. They're Germany and China are good buddies. Well, by 37, they have started this process. They've created a small nucleus army of 80,000 men in 8 divisions. 10,000 man divisions are very small. But they at least have created this force that Chiang will use initially in the war. And they're really key to the early part of the war, this well-trained German group. Well, just briefly on the Anti-Comintern Pact, because you probably all know that this synergy between Germany and China is going to end. And part of the reason that is from this pact. The Comintern Pact is really supposedly about the Communist International, not the Soviet Union. Of course, that's not necessarily true, but indeed, that's what the thinking is, that we're going to have a pact to end world communism. And the Germans are the ones pushing this, and they try to get Japan and China to join this pact. Well, the Chinese don't want any part of this. First of all, they don't trust the Japanese. And second of all, they're getting armaments and financial support from the Soviet Union. So they don't want anything to do with this pact. The Japanese, on the other hand, of course, being heavily anti-communist. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wondered, I just read a lot on it, but how the volunteer group of Flying Tigers supported China? You know about that?
Yeah, but we'll get to that.
Oh, you're going to talk about it.
That's down the future. Okay. So anyway, they signed this pact with the against the Soviets, because it's basically looking at a pact they're afraid of a pact between France and the Soviet Union. The Germans are. And so they basically get everybody involved with this thing. And it's simply that, there's secret protocols, and if anybody attacks Russia, everybody else will remain neutral. It's the usual European hidden deals within these sub packages. And so eventually everybody joins this pact that's in the Axis nations. But what's really important for our class today is this is the first big link between the Japanese and the Nazi government. And so as soon as there's a fight between the Chinese and the Japanese, the Germans are going to cut off all aid to China. That's really the key here. Okay. Well, Chiang also feels that before he can defeat Japan, he's got to crush the Communist Party of China, the CCP. And he starts to attack the Chinese Communist Party in 1934. So much so that he drives them on what's known as the famous Long March. And the communists start out the Long March with about 90,000 people. And by the time they get far into the interior, west interior of China, they are down to about 9,000 people. So Chiang has pretty much crushed the Communist Party by 1935. But the Chinese people think this is a bad idea. Hey, wait a minute, we should be fighting the Japanese, not fighting each other. And this thing becomes more and more increasingly unpopular. Well, I'll make this quick. Chiang has actually gone to visit this warlord, this young marshal, to make negotiations. And he is taken prisoner. And they're thinking, well, maybe we should just kill Chiang, and that'll end this oppression of the communists, and we could support another leader that will perhaps take more of a stance against the Japanese. And this young marshal is basically played as a dupe. I don't want to go too much into this, but he ends up being in prison, and after many years is actually executed. But it does force the Chiang to come to an agreement with the Communist Party. And you can see here a young Mao Zedong toasting with Chiang Kai-shek here. And they are going to agree to stop persecuting the Communist Party and go and become unified against the Japanese. Well, think about this. Chiang has just driven us out of the country. He's killed thousands of our followers, but now we got to make peace with this guy. Well, the reason that is, of course, is because the Russians under Stalin are afraid of Japan, and they know that Chiang is a very popular leader, and the last thing they need is more chaos in China. They need a centralized government in China too. So they basically force Mao into this agreement, and Mao doesn't really have a lot of choice, and so he takes it. Well, talked about the Boxer Rebellion and these legation troops, and by far the Japanese have the most legation troops in the world, or in China, and they really, really have a lot of, remember the Tangyu Truce, they've got that whole big area right by Beijing, and these troops need to exercise. You know, they don't just sit in the barracks all the time. You need to train, you need to do things. And they generally go out on little training missions. And normally these training missions are told to the Chinese. The Japanese training missions are, hey, you know, tonight we're going to go out, we're going to do some missions, so, you know, just be cool about it. Well, on July 7th, 1937, on a moonless night, under the command of Major Iki, they go out and do a training mission. Well, all of a sudden the Chinese see a bunch of Japanese running around in the dark, and nobody's told them there's supposed to be a training mission that day, and a couple of shots are fired. Okay, no big deal. There's lots of incidents in China. Well, they do a roll call, and there's a Private Shimura missing. And Iki goes, well, we got to send out the rest of the battalion to go find Private Shimura. He's, you know, we got to find him. But in the meantime, Private Shimura comes back, but nobody tells Iki this. Where was Private Shimura? Did he go to the bathroom? No one will ever know, because Private Shimura is killed in Burma in 1943. We can't ask him. But Iki goes out, and now there's more Japanese out there, and there's more shots fired. And Iki's like, well, we should de-escalate this. This is getting out of control. All right. So, but he's overruled by his commanding officer, or Colonel Mutaguchi. Well, there's liaison officers who are saying, hey, we need to calm down. You know, everybody's making apologies. And Mutaguchi says, we're not making any apologies. In fact, we're going to start firing artillery at you. And that's what they do. He starts, you know, a major little battle. It's a little town. It isn't a big town, but it's a major little battle going on here. And it starts a 2-day struggle for this little town and this bridge. And eventually the Chinese are driven out of this. Now, note these two characters, Iki and Mutaguchi. Iki will go on to be the officer in charge of the landing force that was sent to Midway Island. Now, they never landed, of course, because of the naval battle of Midway, which we are going to talk about in excruciating detail. And then he goes on to be the first counter landing on the island of Guadalcanal, and launches the first counterattack against the United States Marines, and is killed on Guadalcanal in 1942. So Iki, big place. Now Mutaguchi, on the other hand, he's a strange character. He takes credit later on for starting World War II, because this was a factor of Gekkokujo, that I did the right thing by starting a war so we could control China. And he goes on, and we'll talk about him actually in the second semester, when he's in charge of the Japanese invasion of India in 1944, and that is a complete disaster. In fact, one of the worst military defeats in Japanese history under Mutaguchi. So those two guys had a lot going on to be at this particular site at this time. Well, Chiang is incredibly concerned. And Chiang's diaries are now open, and they're people pretty much, historians think that they're fairly accurate diaries of what he's actually thinking at these times. So is this just another incident? Is this just another minor provocation, or is this the real thing? And he says in his diary, he goes, is this the time to accept the challenge? And he talks to his Germans and more hawkish advisors, and they say, yes, this is the time. And he writes in his diary that they need to attack the dwarf bandits because they hate the Japanese. They don't see the Japanese being any different than the British or any other people that have invaded China. Well, Chiang moves 3 of his German trade divisions north, trying to save Beijing and Tianjin, I believe. Well, the Prime Minister of Japan, Konoye, another interesting character, we'll talk more about him in the future too. He says that, you know, Japan is going to send in more troops, they're going to mobilize, and they're going to deal with this Chinese provocation. Well, Chiang again is afraid of losing Beijing. Indeed, he does. On July 28th and on 30th, they lose Tianjin. A disaster again for the Chinese. Then a really terrible incident takes place on the 29th in a little town. There's a body of puppet troops. These are Mongolian troops that are under theoretically the control of Puyi, that are supporting the Japanese in this part of China. And the Japanese have surrounded a small group of Chinese nationalist soldiers. And they tell them, you have to disarm. We're going to disarm you. And the Chinese soldiers are going, we're not at war. Why are you disarming us? This is ridiculous. And they refuse. And the Japanese begin to slaughter these Chinese nationalist troops. The puppet troops, the Mongolian troops, they're outraged by this. They're like, what are you killing these people for? And they begin to attack the Japanese. They destroy the entire Japanese unit that's been terrorizing these Chinese people. Then they go into this little town and they begin to kill all the Japanese civilians in the town. Over 200 is believed. And this causes a tremendous backlash in Japan that these Mongolians and these nationalist troops have killed this Japanese unit and, of course, Japanese civilians. So that's a huge issue in Japan. And things continue to deteriorate after these events. And finally, the Japanese army, they need approval to do anything more in China. And they reach out to the emperor. And they go to the emperor and say, hey, you know, this is just another incursion. It's no big deal. This will be over in 2 or 3 months. We'll get some more unequal treaties. Everything's going to be great. And the emperor, Hirohito, agrees. He says, okay, fine. You know, this is, you know, well, I will give my imperial support to this incursion. Well, Chiang says, I've got to mobilize. And he reaches out to the Chinese Communist Party and says, I need the Chinese Communist Party to be under my control and the Chinese army part of the Chinese Communist Party. I need your army to be part of my army under our leadership. And Mao says, no, I'm not going to do that. And Chiang is very angry. And Mao goes, well, you know, you could try to do this, but quite honestly, if you do this, you're not going to get any more arms from the Soviet Union. They'll give us arms, but they're not going to give you anything. And Chiang is forced to make probably one of the most important concessions he'll ever make by allowing the Communist Party of China to have its own military force under their own control. This will play out hugely in the future. Well, Prime Minister Konoye in Japan says this. He goes, you know, what is this about? What is this incursion in China about? Well, it's to secure the cooperation in contributing to the development of Oriental culture. Think about that phrase. What is that really saying? It's saying that this is Hako Ichiyu. That indeed Hako Ichiyu is our benevolent rule over Asia, over the world eventually, hopefully. But they believe that they are the true people that are giving out Oriental culture. And anybody that opposes them is supporting Western culture. Amazingly, I think that they take this to this level. So much so that because this has been authorized by the emperor, the benevolent emperor, because he has given his approval for this, to stand against us is basically against the rule of the Yamato people and or what should be Oriental culture. Now, this is going to lead to a Japanese concept they refer to as compassionate killing. Because you are standing against the divine will of the emperor, we don't want to kill you, but you're forcing us to do this. And indeed, that is how the Japanese are going to portray this war throughout the entire time frame up until 1945. And then on August 7th, there's a meeting of Chiang's forces. And it's everybody's there, okay? The peace side of his group, the Nationalists, the Hawks, everybody's at this big meeting. And Chiang says at the meeting, he goes, "Do we fight or shall we be destroyed?" And eventually all factions agree that this is the time when they need to confront the Japanese. And the railroad minister, Zhang, says, "The conference united the entire nation, unseen for centuries. The Japanese must be defeated by the Chinese." That's how they view this. And Chiang ends with this: "The war will be the beginning of a new China." And he is oh so correct, but certainly not the China that he expected it to be. And thank you for coming today.